Last night we stepped into the most forbidden feast Rome ever forgot. A banquet whispered in spice, veiled in laughter, and carved in silence. You walked beside senators and strangers, heard truths folded in honey, and watched masks fall between candlelight. But that was only the beginning. Because in ancient Rome, what happened after the final course was far more dangerous than what was ever served. Tonight, we go deeper, past the velvet drapes, beyond the silence of the plates, into the shadows where memories loosen and intentions are no longer masked but revealed. Welcome back to the night no one was supposed to remember, and yet you did.
The sun did not set. It dissolved slowly, quietly, like something sacred withdrawing behind the edge of the world. When it brushed the ridge of Palatine Hill, the sky didn't darken into black. It turned violet, deep, lush, the color of unspoken agreements, the color of secrets about to rise. They called it velvet dusk because everything, from the oil on the lamps to the folds of the curtains, shimmered softer under that hue. It was not night, not yet, but it was no longer day. It was the in-between, the moment when Rome held its breath, not from fear, but from ritual. In every domus that mattered, the kitchen fires had already gone silent. Wine had been stirred, notes had been played, the third cup had been poured, and now everything paused. Slaves withdrew, not because they were dismissed, but because they were trained to vanish when the violet came. Doors were covered in deep cloth, footsteps fewer, voices hushed. The city did not go quiet. It transformed from a capital of power into a stage of whispers. And in one villa, one guests would never name in public, the transformation was complete. No smoke lingered from the lamps. Every flame burned clean, trimmed by a hand that knew how to silence even fire. The cushions had been fluffed, the wine trays polished, the scent of thyme and myrrh hung in the air, not strong, but enough to remind the arriving guests that what they were stepping into was not a home, it was a veil. Velvet dusk wasn't a time, it was a threshold, a passage, a line crossed in silence. Those who arrived at this hour knew what they were walking into, or at least they pretended to. And those who watched from behind curtained alcoves, they remembered every detail. Who entered first? Who hesitated? Who smiled too long? This hour was not about introductions. It was about observation and anticipation. And so, as the violet deepened and the first notes of syrinx faded in the air, Rome became something else entirely. Its laws still stood, its senators still ruled, but inside this hidden room, lit only by polished flame and scented cloth, a new empire was taking shape.
one of shadows, one of scent, one of silence. And the guests? They stepped in, not to eat, not to drink, not even to watch, but to surrender. To what, they didn't always know.
Velvet was not just fabric. It was memory, draped not for beauty, but for purpose, thick enough to absorb whispers, heavy enough to erase footsteps. It hung in folds beside every door, not as ornament, but as guardian. Those who stepped through never saw who had come before. That was by design. In the villa of secrets, the curtains were the first layer of silence. Woven deep red or royal violet, their threads were soaked in years of ritual. They were pulled shut not by hands, but by timing. When the sky turned that precise shade of dusk, someone, always unseen, closed them, slowly, softly, without a word. And with that motion, the outside world disappeared. Beyond the curtain, the room changed. Voices lowered, posture straightened, faces softened. Guests who moments before had laughed at the garden entrance now spoke in half tones. The velvet reminded them this was not a place for questions, not yet. First they must sit, breathe, watch, because here silence was the first guest and observation was the second. The rest came later, drama, desire, danger. But velvet arrived first. Those who planned these nights knew that memory was fragile. The truth, when spoken too soon, shattered. So they built layers of light, of scent, of music, and of fabric. The curtains served not to hide, but to prepare. The pause they forced between rooms gave the mind time to adjust, from citizen to shadow, from senator to participant. A rarely mentioned inscription found in a private chamber of Ostia described a ritual role known as Domina Velata, the veiled mistress. She did not host, she did not speak, but she watched each curtain. If it moved too fast or too slow, she would intervene, because timing was everything. A guest seen too early could unravel an entire evening. A voice heard from behind velvet could become the next whisper carved into marble. Velvet, then, was not mere cloth. It was Rome's hush. It wrapped the truth in softness. It framed every secret like a stage. And those who walked past its folds entered not a room, but a different version of themselves. Even the scent changed once you passed the velvet. Outside, thyme and sun. Inside, myrrh and sandalwood. Heavier, older, designed to slow the breath, to signal you are no longer in the empire you know. And so, as the oil lamps flickered softly, casting long shadows on silk-draped walls, no one asked who had arrived, or what they carried, or why the host had not yet appeared. The velvet had answered those questions already, with its silence.
Candles were never lit all at once. They were touched, one by one, in a sacred order. The first flame was always placed farthest from the door, the last closest to the seat of power. Not for brightness, but for rhythm, not to see, but to feel. The way the shadows fell was calculated. Some corners were meant to remain in half darkness, because the human eye fears what it cannot fully see, and that fear makes the heart whisper slower. Then came the incense, but this wasn't mere fragrance. No vendor on the street sold these blends. They were ground in silence, stored in dark wooden jars, infused with stories no tongue dared tell. Cinnamon for memory, frankincense for distance, myrrh for forgetting. Each scent was chosen not for its sweetness, but for its echo, the way it lingered in fabric, in skin, and in the quiet space between two unspoken questions. This wasn't decoration, it was design. It was not the beginning of a party, it was the prelude to forgetting, to slipping into a space where time softened, and decisions were no longer fully your own. No music played, no greeting announced, but in the pause between breath and thought, guests began to feel it, that this room was different, that silence had rehearsed its welcome 1,000 evenings before. And those tasked with arranging this silence, they moved like ghosts, not speaking, not touching, only folding, lighting, placing, velvet cushions aligned, goblets placed with the curve facing east, curtains parted but not wide, only enough to suggest a mystery, never enough to reveal it. This was choreography without applause, theater without an audience, and yet it worked, because by the time the first cup was lifted, every guest was already transformed, not fully aware, but quietly rewired. In a city that conquered through swords, this room conquered through breath, through mood, through the absence of sound. And in that absence, something always began.
The Velvet Hour. On a crumbling wall of an ancient bathhouse in Ostia, nearly erased by centuries of steam and silence, archaeologists uncovered a faint inscription. Velvet Hour is when Rome breathes through women. For years, the phrase was dismissed. A poetic flourish, perhaps, or a line from a forgotten play. But as more fragments emerged, a clearer picture began to form. Scholars now believe it referenced a hidden group of Dusk attendants, women not of noble birth, but of sacred training. They were not dancers, not servants, not concubines. There was something older, more deliberate. The velvet attendants, whispered about in documents hidden deep in private libraries, known only through hints in marginalia, in receipts for rare oils, in sudden payments to evening guests that bore no names. These women arrived before the guests. They prepared not the food, but the space, the silence, the scent. They folded the veils, lit the first lamps, and adjusted the shadows just enough so that a room forgot the hour. Their steps were rehearsed to avoid floor creaks. Their touch left no trace, but their presence unmistakable. They moved like mist under torchlight. Their role was not to distract, it was to open, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. A guest who had argued all morning would sit near one and forget the quarrel. Another, unsure if he belonged, would suddenly feel invited. The velvet hour was not measured by time, but by transformation. These women were trained in timing, in atmosphere, in emotional engineering. They knew which incense stirred longing, which flicker of light caused trust to soften, which silence was deep enough to pull truth out of garbed Hades. Their rituals had no scripts, only sequences, only silence. They did not speak to the guests. They didn't need to. A slow glance could set an entire mood. A bow of the head could suggest 1,000 unsaid possibilities. And once the banquet began, they vanished,
slipping into corridors behind silk screens, returning to spaces where names were never spoken. But their imprint remained. In the softened breath of the room, in the way laughter arrived just a beat slower, in how guests raised their goblets, not in thirst, but in unspoken understanding. Some believe the velvet attendants were once priestesses, exiled from temples after Rome changed gods, yet still practicing a sacred role in secret. Others believe they were simply daughters of those who watched too closely and learned the power of presence. Either way, they became the guardians of beginnings, not of events, but of energy. They marked the moment Rome stopped being public and became personal, when empire gave way to intimacy, when conquest paused and ritual took its place. That was the velvet hour, a time no clock could measure, a silence only a certain kind of woman could keep.
When Rome changed clothes, as the final rays of sun dipped behind the tiled rooftops of Palatine villas, and every oil lamp found its intended place, Rome did something quiet. It shed one identity and slipped into another. Not with drums, not with proclamations, but with fabric, with fragrance, with breath held between glances. The city of power and precision, the empire of taxes, tribunals, and marching feet, softened its spine. For a few brief hours it forgot its maps, its laws, its scars. The velvet dusk wrapped around it like a second skin, one sewn not of silk, but of suggestion. In this moment Rome was not a capital, it was a stage, and everyone who entered, whether senator or slave, poet or spy, played their role beneath candlelight. But no one announced the play. There were no scripts, only rituals, only instinct. A nod could shift the course of the evening. A single gaze could reveal a secret or create one. And the ones who noticed, the ones who watched Rome change clothes, knew the transformation was not just visual. It was spiritual. It was sensual. It was deliberate. This hour belonged to mood, to manipulation, to moments that would never be recorded, but never forgotten. The scent of saffron just as the door closed, the brush of velvet as someone passed too close, the silence before the music began again, just slow enough to make you question if it ever stopped. Velvet dusk was not simply a time, it was a veil, a soft curtain drawn between what Rome showed the world and what it allowed only a few to see. It was the breath before the first bite, the hush before the first lie, the pause that made a truth sound sweeter or more dangerous. And when that pause lingered long enough, Rome became something rare. It bloomed not with flowers, but with hunger, not with petals, but with permission. The empire loosened its cloak, and from that quiet space between rules and rituals, a feast emerged. That was the true beginning. Not the arrival of wine, not the clink of silver, but the moment Rome, dressed in dusk, became something other than itself.
The velvet was not just on the walls, it was in the eyes. And from there, in a silence deeper than the law, the banquet began to bloom.
In Rome, a dish was never just food. It was a mask, a metaphor, a memory carved into spice. You didn't simply eat, no, you listened with your tongue. The bread, if it arrived steaming, it whispered urgency. If cold, a calculated delay. The olives, were they wrinkled or smooth? Each carried a story, not of the farmer, but of the guest beside you. The temperature of the soup could reflect the temperature of the host's heart. The sauce's color, the placement of the herbs, the shimmer of the oil, none of it was random. Rome did not dine to survive. It dined to stage, to hint, to reveal, and sometimes to warn. The plate before you was a parchment, the meal a letter, written in flesh and fruit, in salt and smoke. In the candlelight, dishes gleamed like armor, but if you looked closer, they were masks, hiding truths, or perhaps daring you to discover them. Some guests tasted with caution, others devoured as if trying to swallow secrets. And those who cooked, they weren't merely chefs, they were storytellers, strategists. They designed meals the way generals designed battles, with layers, misdirection, and final blows. A sour note in a sweet dessert? It meant a shift. A dry tongue after wine, an unspoken verdict. Food could be forgiveness or betrayal. And in those banquet rooms where wine shimmered like blood and laughter masked intention, every bite could decide a future. A dish could mend a feud or open one, could ignite love or extinguish it. Guests never left full of food. They left full of signals, some decoded, others still lingering. Because in Rome, the hunger wasn't for meat or fruit. It was for meaning. And every course was a test of perception, of wit, of restraint. Those who passed were remembered. Those who failed, they were remembered too, just differently. In silence, in stories, in scars. Above the banquet table, beauty did not reside in light, but in air. From carved channels in the ceiling, so delicate they looked like ivy vines, unseen hands released mist, a quiet breath of sandalwood, a hint of crushed rose, a faint trace of burning myrrh. These weren't chosen to impress, they were chosen to influence. Guests didn't notice at first, not with their eyes, but something in their chest loosened, the back straightened less, the voice grew warmer, the laughter slower, more sincere. Fragrance was not decoration, it was invitation. Each scent released in rhythm with the meal. As the fish arrived, a sigh of rosemary. As the wine deepened, jasmine. And as dessert drew close, amber with a touch of sweet bay leaf. It wasn't perfume, it was persuasion. Designed not to seduce the body, but to seduce the will. And by the third course, the very air between the guests began to change. Eyes met longer.
Sentences grew more honest. The air whispered, and the guests whispered back. This was no accident. The ceiling had been carved not merely for beauty, but for breath, for control, for confession. Some said it was the food. Others blamed the wine. But the most revealing truths were not coaxed by flavor or drink. They rose like mist from above. The ceiling itself became a net, and every inhale a thread that pulled tighter. In a city ruled by architecture, the true power sometimes hung above the eye line, disguised as beauty, delivered as strategy. The Romans knew to change what people say, you don't start with their mouths, you start with their lungs. And when guests spoke that night about love, about regret, about what they'd never said aloud before, they didn't realize it wasn't just the night that listened. It was the ceiling. It was after the olives, always after the olives, that quiet threshold where performance slipped and people became people again. At first it was barely noticeable, a slower blink, a quieter chuckle, a guest reaching for figs without asking. But in that moment the banquet shifted. The dishes changed their purpose. They were no longer designed to dazzle. They were designed to disarm. Figs soaked in honeyed wine. Oysters presented with fresh petals, soft, open, vulnerable. These weren't meals, they were mirrors. Guests didn't just eat, they revealed. With every bite, posture changed. A senator, once proud, now leaned closer. A widow with clenched hands now let go of her spoon. The forks, silent, delicate, unassuming, became the night's confessional. Not every word was spoken aloud, but every gesture, every hesitation, every extra sip of wine whispered what the tongue would never dare say. And this was not chance. The courses were planned like poetry, each one a verse in a story meant not for memory, but for release. Chefs didn't just cook, they listened. And somewhere between the dates and the roasted quail, guests stopped guarding their faces. Their hearts began to leak. The flick of a napkin, the pause before swallowing, the slow tearing of bread, these became languages, expressions of fear, desire, doubt. One philosopher once wrote, "In Rome, a plate can be more honest than a promise." And tonight, every plate held a secret. Sometimes love, sometimes regret, sometimes a truth not even the guest had realized until the fig melted on their tongue. The olive had marked the end of the mask. What followed was not a meal. It was memory unfolding, soft, subtle, deep. And it wasn't the mouth that remembered. It was the soul.
In one tattered scroll attributed to Apicius, the culinary mind behind Rome's most mysterious dishes, there exists a line written in faded ink and cautious language. A broth, he says, sweetened, gentle, but stirred with herba oblivionis, the herb of forgetting. It wasn't deadly. That wasn't its purpose. It was precise, strategic, a soft distortion of memory, not to erase, but to blur. Guests would leave remembering how they laughed, how they danced, how the figs tasted like gold, but not what they whispered, not what they confessed.
It was, in essence, a shield, a silk veil drawn over the truth before morning arrived. Rome, at its most powerful, understood something no empire dared admit, that forgetting could be just as useful as remembering, especially in a city where words were weapons and memory a witness. Used in the right dose, herba oblivionis did not silence, it softened. Conversations lost their edges, promises dissolved without friction. A senator's slip of the tongue could be wiped clean by dessert. A lover's indiscretion could melt with the honey in a cup. Some hosts used it to protect their guests, others to protect themselves. But in either case, it worked. No shouts, no confrontations, only the smooth drift of certainty becoming maybe. Did she really say that? Did he truly reveal his plans? Or was it just the scent of wine and rose confusing the mind? That was the brilliance. That was the danger. In banquets where truth was inevitable, forgetting became mercy. And so, beneath chandeliers of crushed pearl and behind curtains soaked in myrrh, Rome's most secret conversations took place, guarded not by guards, but by forgetfulness itself. Herba oblivionis was rarely spoken of aloud, but those who dined often, those who confessed too easily, came to know its taste. Not bitter, not strange, just faint, like memory when it begins to let go.
By the end, even the room had shifted. The corners softened, the air hung heavier, scented not with perfume, but with memory. Plates returned with desserts touched in gold leaf, sugared petals and drops of something unknown. The light dimmed, not suddenly, but like dusk folding over water. Every voice had grown lower, not tired, just distant, as if echoing from another time. Guests no longer spoke in sentences, but in fragments, names half said, feelings half shared. The banquet was no longer a gathering, it had become a spell, one that thickened with each final bite. There was always a moment, never marked by a toast or a bell, when the room passed into something else. Conversation no longer moved forward. It turned in quiet spirals. Laughter still floated, but thinner now and less certain. If someone had asked who left first, no one could answer. If someone had stayed longer than they should, no one remembered. The final course was rarely finished, not out of politeness, but reverence. It was no longer food, it was closure, mystery, and something unspoken that felt like truth. Hosts, too, seemed different by then. They didn't guide, they drifted, gently from chair to chair like dream figures checking on others in sleep. No deals were made, no lines were drawn, and yet something was decided. In that silence, memories tangled, whispers bled into candlelight. What had been shared? Who had said too much or too little? It didn't matter anymore, because morning would not hold it. Memory, like the final course, melted before it could be named. And that was the genius, the cruelty, the grace. Rome did not always record. Sometimes it let the night erase. So when the last dish was cleared, the guests didn't rise quickly. They lingered, gazing at reflections on empty goblets, waiting for the room to tell them who they had become. And then, silence, like a breath taken together. The end of the banquet was never loud, only velvet, only vapor. And in that hush, something ancient was passed on, not in words, not in food, but in feeling, a thread between souls, which brings us into the garden, where shadows stretch longer than voices, where the air is cooler, but the hearts warmer. The banquet is over, but Rome's secrets have only just begun to echo in the leaves.
The garden looked like rest, but it wasn't. It was a second stage where real power slipped between leaves. Cypress trees stood tall, like listeners who never blinked. White roses, still fragrant from dusk, lined paths that remembered every footstep. And yet no one ran, no one shouted. In the garden, silence was law, but whispers were currency. There were no official guards, yet every soul knew it was being watched, not by men, but by memory. Rome's gardens were not merely for strolling, they were for surrender, of secrets, of control, of names that were spoken only in shadow. You could tell who ruled the moment not by what they said, but by where they stood. The most powerful did not sit on marble benches. They leaned against old trees, or stood just outside the lantern's reach. The best agreements were made where the light ended. That line between moonglow and mystery, that was the Roman contract. The gravel crunched differently when decisions were near, and no flower ever bloomed by accident. Roses were planted by servants who knew politics better than poets. Beneath each bloom, a story, a signal, a warning. Some guests walked slowly, not out of grace, but calculation. Their silks rustled like maps. The garden had no walls, and yet everything was contained. Emotion, memory, revenge. It all stayed here, as if the night air refused to let it leave. There was a kind of choreography to it, how shoulders turned, how voices dropped, how glances lasted just long enough to become questions. Rome was an empire of columns and courts, but here beneath branches and jasmine it was something older, more primal, more honest. Nothing written, everything meant. The garden wasn't quiet. It just spoke in a different language, a language of steps, of pauses, of glances that weighed more than gold.
You wouldn't see a scroll or a handshake. Deals weren't written, they were breathed. Will you, if he does? Not tonight. Words half said, promises formed not by lips, but by pauses. The garden was where secrets made eye contact, where threats wore perfume, and where a single nod could change the course of tomorrow. You could hear the future in the way someone exhaled, in how slowly their fingers trailed the ivy. No need for witnesses. The trees had seen enough. The breeze carried more meaning than parchment. These were not dramatic negotiations. They were like smoke, curling, subtle, undeniable. Every whisper had a history, every silence a weight. The more you said, the less they believed. That was the rule. Only those who mastered stillness could truly negotiate here. And the shadows? They weren't empty. They were seats, reserved, for the ones who didn't need to be named. You could walk past a hedge and hear an entire alliance shift with a single glance. Rome taught men to speak, but the garden taught them to mean. A brush of fabric, a change in breathing, that was enough. Because here, in the velvet hush of night, the game wasn't about shouting louder. It was about vanishing softer. The real rulers weren't in the banquet. They were here, in sandalwood-scented corners, beneath cypress that knew how to listen. Their power came from restraint, from silence so precise that it cut deeper than steel. When someone leaned close and whispered, "It is done," they didn't need to explain what. Everyone already knew. No parchment, no seal, just the hush of leaves agreeing. And if someone laughed too loud or stepped where they shouldn't, the silence would fold around them like a warning. The garden remembered disobedience, and it rarely forgave. This wasn't politics, it was choreography, one where the absence of sound was the most dangerous line ever spoken.
In a hidden tomb near the Appian Way, archaeologists uncovered a coded inscription. It spoke of a woman, once a slave, who was known only as Aurelia of the Leaves. She wasn't a servant at the table, but an ear among the vines, paid not in coins, but in silence. Her job? To listen, to remember, and to sell that memory only when the stakes were high enough. She moved like rustling branches, unnoticed, unremarkable, yet always present. The garden, it seems, had its own historian, not one who wrote, but one who waited, for a moment, for a phrase, for a betrayal whispered too close to the lilies. The inscription called her the breath between the leaves, a name given not by family, but by fear. Her loyalty was never sworn, it was rented by the night, by the danger, by the weight of a truth too volatile for daylight. While others bartered influence with wine, Aurelia bartered with memory. Her power was in what she didn't repeat, and in the rare moment she did, Rome shifted. Empires tilted, not because someone shouted, but because someone finally remembered and whispered it back. Aurelia was no spy. She was something older, something Roman. The garden wasn't just a stage, it was an archive of glances, of hesitations, of unfinished sentences. She catalogued them all. She knew which lover paused too long before answering, which senator's voice cracked when he said, "Never again." The stone inscription ends with only one phrase, scratched smaller than the rest, almost hidden inside a petal engraving. She heard what the Republic forgot to write down. There was no statue to honor her, no name on record, but in the night breeze, near those silent cypress trees, you could still feel her presence, still feel the weight of truths never spoken, but never gone. Because in Rome, the strongest memories didn't live in marble, they lived in women like Aurelia, forgotten by design, remembered by silence. You didn't need parchment to be summoned, just a soft voice behind a hedge, a lingering glance across a flickering lantern. In Rome's gardens, desire wasn't shouted. It circled, it waited, it hummed. The night air was thick with more than flowers. It carried questions no one dared ask aloud, and answers that never left the lips. There were no formal gestures, no scrolls sealed with wax. The invitation might come as the sudden absence of a person beside you, and the faintest sound of sandals brushing gravel deeper within the cypress paths. And if you followed, it wasn't with your feet, but with curiosity, with pulse, with silence. The garden invited not with commands, but with clues. Who left the rose petal on your seat? Who shifted the lantern to face your direction? These weren't accidents, they were messages, not written, but felt, and understood only by those attuned to the mood of velvet dusk. In this air, every pause was deliberate, every turn of the head had meaning, and every silence had weight. The guests learned quickly that not all summons required words. A single glance could open doors no key ever would. And if a soft perfume brushed your shoulder, or a hush fell as you crossed a path, you had already been chosen, not for who you were, but for what you might say next, or reveal, or regret. Because sometimes in Rome, the most dangerous moment wasn't what was said, it was the breath before, the look that lingered, the warmth of a shadow too close. The invitation was in the space between steps, in the breath between glances, in the echo between questions never asked. And some, once summoned, never returned the same. The garden didn't just whisper secrets, it offered choices, temptations, and promises no one ever wrote down. That was its beauty and its danger.
By the time the main hall dimmed and laughter faded, the real work had begun. Beneath fig trees and rose vines, guards were either asleep or well paid to be. Guests walked slowly, as if their sandals feared the grass. This wasn't rest, it was ritual, the moment when titles meant less than secrets. And Rome, shimmering, fragrant Rome, shifted its weight to new hands, one whisper at a time. No fanfare, no ceremony, just two shadows meeting where lanterns dared not glow. The man who laughed loudest an hour ago was now silent. The woman in emerald, once surrounded, now stood alone beneath a jasmine arch, waiting. They didn't speak, not yet. They breathed, they measured, they remembered. Every word spoken before the banquet returned now as a question. Who heard? Who noticed? Who waited just long enough? And when they finally stepped close, no closer than breath, no farther than risk, their voices did not rise. They dipped into promises, into veiled demands, into the space between diplomacy and desire. This was Rome's second hour, not of empire, but of exchange, not ruled by generals, but by glances, pauses, and the delicate curve of a yes spoken like a maybe. Beneath the fig leaves, hands were not shaken, but decisions were. Beneath the rose vines, futures were rewritten, not with ink, but with intention. Power didn't shout in the garden. It inhaled. It waited. It moved like perfume in the dark, noticed only by those it touched, and when it landed, it left no fingerprints, only outcomes. A name erased from the Senate list, a villa deed quietly reassigned, a shipment diverted to the wrong harbor,
or the right one. And in the distance, Rome slept, or pretended to. It wasn't betrayal, it wasn't loyalty, it was balance. The garden had no throne, but it had consequences. By dawn, no one would speak of what occurred, not because they feared the truth, but because the truth had already moved on, into other hands, into other nights, into the next guest, walking alone, into the jasmine, into the dark. And so ended the whispers, not with answers, but with rearranged silence. Rome didn't need daylight to change its fate. It only needed a garden and the courage to listen.
The final footsteps faded beneath fig leaves. A breeze brushed the garden one last time, carrying the scent of wilted roses and whispered names. The laughter from the banquet hall had long dissolved into the walls. Plates cleared, cups emptied, music silenced. The celebration had ended, or so it seemed. The moon, now high and silvered like old coin, watched as the guests thinned. Some departed with quiet nods, others with lingering eyes, carrying secrets in their sleeves or on their lips. But the ones who mattered, the ones whose presence could tilt decisions and rearrange futures, they stayed. Always the same few, never the loudest, never the most adorned, just the most anchored. They didn't need to say they were important. The garden already knew. They sat differently, breathed differently, as if every rustle of the leaves waited for their approval. And when the last casual guest disappeared through the gate, the entire place shifted, not in sound, but in spirit. No servant announced the change, no bell rang, but everyone who remained felt it, the end of the visible night and the beginning of something far more delicate. This was not the Rome of roads and rules anymore. This was the Rome of permission, of unsaid agreements. The cypress trees, tall and ancient, became silent witnesses. Their shadows stretched long across marble paths, framing the space like curtains drawn around a stage. Here, masks loosened, not thrown away, just relaxed. There was no need for formality. Titles had already been uttered at dinner. Applause had already been received. In this hour, all that remained was essence, the pure core of intention. Guests no longer needed roles. They moved as themselves, raw, unfiltered, cloaked only in moonlight and the weight of what they knew. One leaned closer, not to speak, but to listen. Another brushed fingers against ivy, waiting, not for words, but for acknowledgement. The very air seemed to pulse slower, as if the garden itself respected what was about to unfold. This was not rest, this was not leisure, this was transition, from ritual to revelation, from performance to authenticity, from garden to theater. It was here, beneath stars sharp enough to wound, that tomorrow's headlines began. Not written, but breathed. Not witnessed, but felt. If you stood quietly enough, you wouldn't hear names. You'd hear patterns, repeated pauses, familiar glances, the shuffle of a sandal hesitating on gravel. These were the signs, the cues, the invisible ink of Rome's real narrative. The second part of the night had no script, and yet it had been rehearsed for years, for generations, always the same sequence, always the same players. What changed was only the stakes, and tonight they were higher than most would ever know.
There was no trumpet to begin it, no servant to announce it. The second feast never needed sound. Its beginning was felt in a breath held too long, in a glance that lingered too deep. It was not marked by candles or silverware. It began when the final clinks of the official banquet faded, and those who stayed behind looked at each other not as guests, but as mirrors. The table was gone, the rules dissolved. Names no longer mattered. Titles stripped off like velvet robes tossed onto marble benches. The second feast wasn't written into history, but it shaped it. There were no assigned seats. People stood, reclined, shifted without instruction. The air changed. It didn't just smell of flowers anymore. It pulsed with tension, like a perfume made of questions. Who are you when no one is watching? Who do you become when your rank is no longer armor? That was the invitation. Silent, invisible. A challenge disguised as a moment. Some answered with a glance, some with the tilt of a head, some by doing nothing at all, because doing nothing in this space could mean everything. The second feast did not offer food, it offered exposure. Beneath the thin veil of moonlight, those who remained revealed not skin, but truth. They traded not gossip, but gravity. A senator's wife removed her ring, not because she was unfaithful, but because it was the only way to be seen as herself. A poet quoted someone else's verse, not to impress, but to admit he'd forgotten his own. A merchant who never bowed in public knelt before a gardener's daughter just to feel something unscripted. The masks didn't just come off, they multiplied. Each person at the second feast became several versions of themselves, shifting fluidly between gesture and silence, between charm and honesty. And yet no one lied, because in this rare hour, truth had its own seduction. The room, or what remained of it, grew darker, but no one reached for light, because clarity here wasn't meant to be seen, it was meant to be felt. A ripple in the fabric of performance, a breath held in the throat of power. There were no photographs, no frescoes painted of this gathering, but if Rome ever truly changed, it was here, in these moments that dissolved before dawn, in these whispers that vanished into silk, in the courage it took to meet eyes with someone you would never greet in daylight, and ask nothing, expect nothing, just be.
The Emperor Domitian ruled with silence, and ended in silence. Most of what he built was buried, his statues shattered, his edicts erased, his name condemned by the Senate in a ritual damnatio memoriae, damnation of memory. But not everything vanished. Deep within the stone corridors of the Vatican archives, sealed behind centuries of mistrust, one fragment remained. Not a decree, not a letter, just the corner of a record, scorched on one edge and smudged by time. It mentioned a gathering, a second feast. No names, no dates, only a line scrawled in a hand that seemed hurried and fearful. When the first wine ends, the real drink begins. Historians argued. Some said it was metaphor. Others insisted it referred to an event held only for those who survived emperors. A ritual not of celebration, but of balance, of shift. The second feast was not about indulgence. It was about influence. It did not require wealth or lineage or even charm, only longevity and leverage.
These were not the men who built Rome's monuments. They were the ones who ensured their names were carved deeper than the emperors who commissioned them. After Domitian's public appearances ended and the palace quieted, certain figures remained. The advisor who never raised his voice, the widow who owned half the harbor, the artist whose frescoes disguised passwords. They were not seated at tables. They arranged who would sit at tables tomorrow. And when they met, under torchlight or fig leaves, words were used less than presents. A breath was a vote. A pause was a veto. The second feast wasn't where emperors ruled. It was where they were replaced, quietly, elegantly, without blood, but with precision. Perhaps that's why so few traces remain, not because it was forbidden, but because it was finished before morning came. By then, the scrolls had already changed hands. The guards had already switched allegiances. The maps had already been redrawn in ink invisible to most eyes. The Vatican fragment ends mid-sentence, and if the oil is spilled, let the rose. Nothing more. No rose, no ending. Just the understanding that the power behind Rome wasn't loud, it was layered, passed not through coronations, but through candle-lit glances. It didn't need a crown, just a moment, a nod, and memory sharp enough to survive centuries of flame.
There was a moment, neither marked by bells nor by trumpet, when the second feast shifted, not outwardly, but in spirit. The garden grew quieter, the lanterns dimmer, but the faces, those remained hidden, and that was the point. This was the hour when power didn't need a name or a title. It wore silk, yes, but also masks. Not the theatrical kind, not painted or feathered. These were simpler, thinner, a veil, a cloth, a shadow. Enough to blur the difference between emperor and envoy, between servant and senator. In this hour, you didn't need permission to act outside your role. You only needed silence, a nod, a shared glance that said, "Tonight we trade truths, not identities." A senator, stoic and feared in daylight, might refill cups and watch quietly for approval. A slave, eyes lowered for most of the empire's day, might speak a single sentence that echoed louder than a speech. And no one interrupted, no one objected. Because in this hour, the inversion wasn't chaos, it was clarity. Here, at this edge of night, power revealed itself not by what was worn, but by what was risked. The risk to speak without armor, to move without title, to feel without mask. And yet the masks remained. Ironically, they gave people permission to be honest. It was never the face that told the truth. It was the distance from it. The veil invited a different kind of voice, one unshaped by expectation, one that didn't need to match past decisions. And when someone spoke from behind silk or shadow, it was not the words people remembered, but the temperature of the truth. Some confessed to betrayal. Others made oaths they'd never speak again. A few laughed, not at jokes, but at the absurdity of pretending during the day. And still, no one dared to say the same thing twice, because truth, when spoken in such rooms, changed shape by morning. Ask 10 guests what was said, and you'd get 10 stories, each sincere, each different. That was the nature of these masks. They didn't just hide, they reflected. Not the face, but the intention. Not the moment, but the memory it left behind. And so, when the final flickers of firelight caught the corners of their veils, and the hush became heavier than words, Rome didn't sleep. It listened. It inhaled every syllable beneath those coverings, and it stored them, not in scrolls, but in pulse and breath, in the unseen archive of hearts changed by a single night. A night not remembered by the empire, but felt, again and again, in the silence that followed.
No one spoke of this second feast, ever. Not in daylight, not in writing, not even in coded letters tucked behind marble busts or inked in lemon juice between the lines of a poem, because this feast, this final act, was more than secret. It was sacred in its danger. Not sacred like prayer, sacred like fire. Beautiful to watch, fatal to touch. You see, in Rome, silence wasn't always avoidance. Sometimes silence was armor, the kind worn after midnight, when masks had been removed and truths had been exposed, not shouted, not confessed, but leaked like scent from an open vial. What happened in that final hour wasn't meant to echo, it was meant to dissolve. In candle smoke, in the rustle of silk, in the breath held just before a name was spoken, and then never was. If you asked those who attended, they would blink slowly, smile faintly, and say nothing. They had trained their memories to misplace what mattered, not out of cruelty, but for protection. For power, for peace that only forgetfulness could offer. They knew what words could do, and what they could undo. Empires had risen on whispers, fallen on murmurs. So this unspoken feast was safer, unnamed. Yet it shaped everything. You could see its trace in how a senator's gaze lingered longer on arrival, how a servant was promoted, seemingly out of nowhere, how a law shifted just slightly, and yet redefined the balance of influence. These were the echoes of a night never documented, a map rewritten in candlelight and folded into memory like a forbidden scroll. Sometimes the only witness was the moon, pale, patient, and bound by no allegiance. It saw what no scribe dared record, the touch that meant an alliance, the laugh that hid a threat, the silence that carried an ultimatum. And once, just once, there was someone who stayed too long, a guest whose footsteps lingered in the dew, who watched as masks were folded, as veils were tucked away, as the air returned to stillness and Rome began to put its face back on. That guest, they remembered everything. But memory has a cost, one that hums in the bones even when the mind forgets, one that pulls you back to the same garden, the same bench, the same scent of roses and ash, not because you seek the truth, but because the truth seeks you. And so as the city began to wake, as servants relit the braziers, and scribes sharpened their quills, Rome wore its morning mask again, calm, dignified, imperial. But underneath, ash still clung to the folds of silk, petals still drifted down from trees that had heard too much, and somewhere, far from marble halls, one guest sat quietly, not remembering, and yet not quite forgetting either. Between the last whisper and the first light, a breathless hush bloomed, where petals met ashes and memory burned silently on the tongue.
The night had ended, But no one announced it. No trumpet, no curtain, no farewell. Just a soft shift from mystery to memory. At first there was only silence, not the kind that sleeps, but the kind that remembers. Morning light crept through colonnades with the patience of something ancient. It did not rush, it lingered. It paused above each surface as if asking, "What happened here?" The petals were the first to speak, scattered like fragments of a sentence never finished. Then a streak of wine on cold marble, still glossy as though just spilled. A sandal lay sideways beneath a chair, its owner long gone. The garden, the banquet hall, the stone steps, they all exhaled at once. Not relief, but release. The scent of roses still lingered, but it had changed, fainter, touched by something ashy, as if sorrow had passed through it. The guests were gone, but their absence was louder than their presence had ever been. Every object in the space became a relic. The cushion still indented where someone leaned in too close. A goblet left standing with a single drop of honeyed wine. Curtains swayed even without wind, like echoes of movement still not finished. It was not the kind of scene one would clean up. It was one you preserved, because this was no longer a setting. It was aftermath. Rome itself seemed to hold its breath, as if the city knew what had occurred under moonlight and wished to keep it buried beneath sunlight. What the light found that morning wasn't chaos. It was clarity, but a clarity so delicate, so woven with unspoken truths, that it could exist for a moment, just long enough for the eyes to see it before the mind refused to believe it. A new day had begun, but the shadow of the night before followed it like a second skin. And as the sun rose higher, everything the light touched shimmered, not with grandeur, but with quiet reverence. Because what had taken place wasn't merely indulgence, it was transformation. Not in loud acts, but in quiet choices. In whispered names, in glances no one dared hold too long. And now the garden bore witness to what remained, not evidence, but essence. A stillness that didn't beg to be disturbed. A story that didn't demand to be told, but was nonetheless written, in petals, in glass, in silence. The kind of story only Rome could forget so completely, and yet never truly let go.
They had been there just hours ago, laughing, tasting, whispering beneath the breath of gardens and ceilings alike. But when the first ray of gold broke through the sheer drapery, the ones who had stayed until moonset stirred in silence. No trumpet, no clapping, just the quiet shiver of a soul that knew something had been exchanged. The room was still the same, its pillars familiar, the fabric soft, the aroma faintly perfumed, yet the air had thickened, as if it now held names unspoken, decisions unshared, memories only partially remembered. And the hands of those waking? They were not empty. Some clenched scrolls that did not exist yesterday. Others hid letters within sleeves, letters that could open palaces or burn reputations.
A few simply rubbed their palms, as though trying to feel what they had agreed to. Rome itself seemed to stretch slowly, like a lion uncurling after watching from the shadows all night. Its breath moved down the streets, past temples and terraces, over gardens still scented with secrets. Nothing looked out of place, and yet everything had shifted. Power, once seated at tables with golden plates, had now scattered, dripping down vine-laced arches, settling beneath sandal prints, embedding itself into quiet nods and hesitant glances. Those who ruled yesterday still wore crowns, but they knew they had shared too much or learned too little. And in that fog of unacknowledged truth, the city began to wake. But not in the place it had been, not in the Rome of rules and records. This was another Rome, one that existed between the petals and ashes, one born not of bricks, but of breath. Somewhere along the colonnades, a servant whispered a name she wasn't supposed to know. A merchant paused, looked at a coin longer than usual, as if it carried more than value, perhaps a vow. A senator, alone in his villa, stared at his own hand and whispered, "It wasn't mine to take." But no one replied, for no one would admit what had been done or undone. In Rome, stories that mattered were not written, they were remembered, and only for as long as necessary. After that, they dissolved like incense at sunrise. What remained were gestures, silences, reassignments. A rose trimmed differently in a garden, a guard's route altered, a rumor placed just carefully enough to bloom. And so Rome awoke, but not where it had fallen asleep. It awoke somewhere else, deeper, quieter, older, as if the empire had turned in its bed and now faced a new direction, one paved not with marble, but with memory.
There is a saying older than parchment, older than marble, older even than the temples that now crumble under ivy's slow weight. It was not written in books, not spoken aloud in Senate halls, but it passed through lips slick with wine and eyes that met only in passing glances. True power is never granted. It is poured in wine and passed in silence. No author claimed it. No orator used it in speeches, but everyone who mattered in Rome had heard it and remembered. Its origin, unknown. Its meaning, felt more than taught. But one clue survived the centuries, a ceremonial shield, unearthed near the Appian Way in a tomb with no name. Its surface was bronze, dull with age, but behind it, scratched with a tool small and precise, the words remained, barely legible, easily missed, as if it had never meant to be found, or as if it always knew it would be, only when the time was right. The shield bore no crest, no house, no empire.
It was the kind displayed, not wielded, yet behind it, tucked in a place only curiosity could reach, was a truth too dangerous to wear openly, a truth that never shouted but always settled, because in Rome power didn't knock. It didn't arrive with a crown or a trumpet. It drifted like perfume at dusk. It whispered like the hem of silk robes brushing along marble corridors, and it stayed. Some say the shield belonged to a general who lost his name after winning the wrong war. Others say it was gifted at a second feast, one of those rare rituals where masks fell and empires trembled. But the most haunting theory is also the simplest, that the shield was meant to be found, not when Rome was at its strongest, but when it began to forget what made it powerful. And so it waited, beneath dust, beneath layers of time, until one day hands reached in not for conquest, but for understanding. The phrase carved behind that shield never changed Rome officially, but it revealed something truer than any law, that power, real power, lives not in names, but in silences, in glances, in what is never said, but always understood. And somewhere tonight, as petals fall in some forgotten garden, and old marble echoes the hush of morning, that phrase still lingers, in minds that remember, and in shadows that never needed permission to rule.
Not all ash comes from fire. Some drifts down after memory collapses. When too much is revealed, the mind recoils, not in fear, but in silence. That's what lingered beneath the petals, not soot from flame, but something softer, stranger, the quiet dust of truths no longer needed. The guests awoke slowly, not with gasps, but with glances. Their eyes searched the room for what they couldn't name. They saw wine stains that looked like maps, petals that hadn't wilted but had stopped blooming, ash that seemed to hum, almost whisper, though it said nothing at all. One guest placed a palm on the cold marble wall, tracing it as if the stone could speak back. Another looked up at a statue, one they had passed dozens of times, but today it looked different. The eyes seemed wetter, the mouth less certain, as if even the carved witnesses had borne too much. Words were hard to form. Some tried, opening mouths only to let out sighs, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much, and no word felt equal to what had passed. The ash clung gently to the floor, to the folds of robes, to the edges of sandals, not as a stain, but as a reminder that something profound had happened, and that it had left no scars, only questions. In the quiet, time stretched. Minutes moved like oil. Even the birds, usually loud by this hour, stayed hushed, as if the garden, the columns, the very air knew that something had changed. No one could recall everything, but no one had truly forgotten either. The kind of memory left behind was woven not into thought, but into presence, into how hands moved, how silence fell, how people began to look at each other with less certainty and more weight. The ash was not empty. It held what language couldn't carry. It floated on breath and settled into marble and waited, just in case anyone would dare to ask what truly happened the night before, and no one did.
By noon the petals were gone, lifted by breeze or gathered by unseen hands. What was left were stones and stains and the subtle echo of music no longer playing. The laughter had receded into memory, like a dream that fades with sunlight. The city, faithful to its rhythm, moved forward. Merchants opened stalls. Children chased shadows. A senator read out new laws no one truly heard. But beneath the marble, something had changed, not visibly, not loudly, but unmistakably. Rome had shifted, not in statues or columns, but in the quiet ways people now looked at each other. A glance held longer, a silence meant more. A door left open was no longer just a door. For those who had stayed, the ones who whispered by hedges, who drank from cups that left no trace, they carried something no decree could erase, a feeling, a scent, a memory that wore no face but knew every name. Even the flowers seemed to know. New roses began to bloom, but slower, as if the soil itself paused to listen, and the ruins, cracked stones and faded paint, felt less like endings and more like beginnings that refused to be written. Because the true Rome didn't live in marble, it lived in breath, in silence, in the spaces between what was spoken and what was meant. And though no one dared speak of that night, though no poet wrote it, no historian dared name it, every whisper afterward carried its scent, every pact sealed in a glance, every hand that lingered too long, every law bent gently around a corner. It wasn't the banquet they remembered, it was what bloomed beneath it. And if this tale stirred something deep, some echo in your own silence, some trace of a memory you can't name, then perhaps you too have touched the edges of what Rome truly was, a city not only of empires, but of secrets, and of petals that never truly wilted. So rest now, traveler. Let your breath slow. The feast is done. The silence remains. And in that silence, who knows what power you carry next? Whisper back if you remember, or don't. Some things bloom only when forgotten. Roses. For more stories buried in dust and light, subscribe to Timeless Murmurs, where history sleeps, but never stays silent.